In a quiet suburb, elderly dog Drake faces a harrowing police confrontation sparked by a mistaken call about a stray. James Carter, his devoted owner, and a united neighborhood rally to protect him, turning chaos into triumph. Their fight uncovers the truth, saves a lost dog, and spurs police reform. From one old dog's courage blooms a legacy of love, community, and lasting change. Welcome to Critters Planet. Here we provide you heartwarming stories of animals. Subscribe more such stories. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the sleepy suburban neighborhood where James Carter had lived for nearly 2 decades. It was the kind of place where the air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass and the hum of a distant lawnmower, blended with the laughter of kids racing their bikes down cracked sidewalks. Porches sagged under the weight of potted plants, and neighbors waved lazy hellos over picket fences. To an outsider, it might have seemed like a postcard of ordinary bliss, a haven untouched by the chaos of the wider world. But for James, it was more than that. It was home, a sanctuary carved out of years of quiet routines, shared with the one soul who'd been by his side through it all. Drake, his elderly Labrador retriever mix. Drake lay sprawled across the backyard, his golden muzzle resting on a patch of sun-warmed grass near the garden fence. At 12 years old, his once sprightly gait had slowed to a gentle shuffle, his joints creaking like the old oak floorboards inside James's house. The black and tan coat that used to gleam in the sunlight was now frosted with grey, especially around his eyes. Eyes that still sparkled with a soft, trusting warmth whenever James was near. That afternoon, as the late spring breeze rustled the leaves overhead, Drake's chest rose and fell in a slow, contented rhythm. His ears twitched faintly at the sound of a squirrel skittering along the fence, but he didn't stir, chasing anything. Faster than a drifting shadow was a young dog's game, and Drake had long since traded youthful exuberance for the simple joy of napping in his favorite sunny spot. James watched from the back porch, leaning against the railing with a mug of coffee cooling in his hands. At 53, his own hair had started to gray at the temples, and the lines etched into his face told stories of laughter, loss, and the steady march of time. He'd bought this house, a modest 2-story with peeling blue paint, after his divorce needing a fresh start. Back then, Drake had been a gangly pup, all floppy ears and boundless energy, tumbling into James's life like a gift he hadn't known he needed. Together, they'd weathered lonely nights, celebrated small victories, and built a bond that felt as permanent as the stars pinned to the evening sky. Now, as James sipped his coffee and watched Drake doze, he felt a pang of tenderness mixed with something heavier, an ache that came with knowing their time together was finite. "Getting old's no picnic, is it, buddy?" James murmured, his voice soft enough to blend with the breeze. Drake's tail gave a lazy thump against the ground as if to say, "I'm still here, don't worry." James smiled, but the ache lingered. He'd noticed the signs creeping in over the past year. The way Drake hesitated before climbing the porch steps, the way his breathing hitched after a short walk to the mailbox. Dr. Patel, their vet, had called it normal aging, prescribing joint supplements and gentle pats of reassurance. "He's a tough old boy," she'd said, but James couldn't shake the quiet fear that each sunny afternoon might be one of their last. The neighborhood seemed to sense it too, in its own unspoken way. Ellen Harper, who lived next door, often slipped Drake a biscuit through the fence, her voice lilting as she cooed, "You're still the handsomest fella on the block." Henry Brooks, the widower across the street, would pause his evening strolls to scratch Drake's ears, reminiscing about his own dogs long gone. The local kids, who raced by on bikes until dusk painted the sky orange, had learned to slow down near James's yard, giggling as they tossed a worn tennis ball just far enough for Drake to sniff it without much effort. It was a small, tender conspiracy of care, an acknowledgement that Drake, with his graying muzzle and gentle spirit, was as much a part of this place as the oak trees lining the street. James set his mug on the railing and stepped down into the yard, the grass cool, beneath his bare feet. He knelt beside Drake, running a hand along the dog's flank, feeling the familiar rise and fall of his breathing. "You're living the dream, aren't you?" he said, chuckling as Drake cracked one eye open, then closed it again with a huff. The garden fence, weather-beaten and leaning slightly, framed them like a quiet fortress shielding their little world from whatever lay beyond. James had built it himself years ago, hammer in hand and Drake at his heels, a project born of sweat and stubborn hope. Now it stood as a testament to their shared history, a boundary that kept the chaos at bay. He didn't know it yet, but that fragile peace was about to shatter. In less than an hour, the sound of heavy boots would crunch across his lawn, and raised voices would pierce the stillness. 2 police officers, strangers in crisp uniforms, would loom over Drake, their presence transforming a routine day into a nightmare James couldn't have foreseen. The old dog, who'd never hurt a soul, would cower against that very fence, his whimpers cutting through James like a knife. And James, fueled by a love so fierce it burned, would step into the fray, ready to defend the one companion who'd never let him down. But for now, the backyard was a haven, bathed in the soft light of a fading afternoon. James sat back on his heels, watching Drake's ears twitch as a bird trilled overhead. The world felt steady, safe, held together by the unspoken promise between a man and his dog, a promise that no matter what came, they'd face it side by side. It was a moment so ordinary, so perfect, that it ached with its own fleeting beauty. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the grass, neither James nor Drake could have guessed how soon that quiet would be torn apart, or how their bond would become the heart of a story that would touch everyone around them. The backyard was still bathed in that golden late spring glow when the first hint of trouble crept in. A faint crunch of gravel under boots, barely audible over the rustling leaves. Drake's ears twitched, lifting slightly from his sun-soaked nap near the garden fence. His golden muzzle, dusted with grey, rested on the grass, but his eyes fluttered open, cloudy with age, yet sharp with a flicker of curiosity. James Carter, still kneeling beside him, didn't notice at first. His hand lingered on Drake's flank, tracing the familiar curve of ribs beneath thinning fur, lost in the quiet rhythm of their shared moment. The breeze carried the distant trill of a bird, and the world felt cocooned in its own gentle hum. Then came the voices, low-clipped and unfamiliar, cutting through the stillness like a jagged edge. "Sir, we need you to step back from the dog." The command jolted James upright, his coffee mug tumbling from the porch railing with a dull thud. 2 police officers stood at the far end of his yard, their dark uniforms stark against the soft greens and yellows of the afternoon. One was tall and broad-shouldered, his hand hovering near his utility belt, exuding an air of unyielding authority. The other, shorter and wiry, shifted his weight uneasily, eyes darting between Drake and the fence as if unsure of his footing. James blinked, confusion crashing over him like a wave. His backyard, his sanctuary, had been breached, and these strangers were staring down at Drake like he was some kind of threat. "What's going on?" James's voice came out rougher than he intended, his heart kicking up a notch as he rose to his feet. Drake stirred, lifting his head with a slow, laborious effort, his joints creaking audibly in the quiet. The old dog let out a soft huff, peering at the officers with a mix of bewilderment and exhaustion. He didn't growl, didn't bare his teeth, just watched, tail giving a faint, uncertain thump against the grass. But the tall officer took a step closer, boots sinking into the lawn, and barked, "Stay back, sir. We've had a report of a dangerous dog loose in this area. We need to assess this animal." "Dangerous?" James echoed, the word absurd on his tongue. He glanced down at Drake, whose ears flattened slightly at the raised voice. "The Labrador." Retriever Mick struggled to push himself up, his front legs trembling as he managed a shaky half-stand. His cloudy eyes flicked to James, seeking reassurance, and let out a low, pitiful whine, a sound that stabbed straight through James's chest. "This is Drake. He's 12 years old. He can barely chase a leaf, let alone hurt anyone." "You've got the wrong dog." The shorter officer hesitated, his brow furrowing as he took in Drake's frail frame, ribs visible beneath his coat, legs wobbling under the effort of standing. But the tall one stood firm, jaw tight, his voice carrying an edge of impatience. "We received a call about a large dog roaming yards, acting aggressively. This one was out here unattended when we arrived. Step aside so we can handle it." He gestured sharply at Drake, who flinched, pressing himself closer to the garden fence. The weathered wood creaked as his side brushed against it, and his whine grew softer, more desperate, as if pleading for the strangers to leave him be. James's blood ran hot, a protective instinct surging through him like wildfire. "Handle it?" he snapped, stepping between Drake and the officers, his shadow falling over the trembling dog. "He's not unattended. He's in my yard on my property. And he's not aggressive, he's scared. Look at him." He gestured wildly at Drake, whose tail had stopped moving, now tucked tight against his hind legs. The old dog's breathing quickened, shallow and ragged, his eyes darting between the looming figures and James, searching for safety. The sight of his companion, so trusting, so vulnerable, cornered by these intruders, ignited a fury James hadn't felt in years. The tall officer's hand twitched toward his belt again, and James's stomach twisted. Was that a stun gun? Leash? He couldn't tell, but the implication sent a shiver down his spine. "Sir, calm down," the officer said, his tone clipped. "We're doing our job. If this dog's a threat, we need to secure him. Move, or we'll have to—" He didn't finish, but the threat hung heavy in the air, a dark cloud over the sunlit yard. The shorter officer shifted again, muttering something under his breath. Maybe a protest, maybe an agreement. But it was lost in the crackling tension. "Secure him?" James's voice rose, incredulous, trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "He's an old dog. He's got arthritis, for God's sake. You're scaring him half to death over some mix-up." He crouched beside Drake, resting a hand on the dog's trembling shoulder, feeling the rapid thud of his heartbeat through the thin layer of fur. "Hey, buddy, it's okay," he murmured, his voice softening despite the storm raging inside. Him. "I'm right here, nobody's taking you." Drake leaned into him, muzzle pressing against James's knee, a shaky exhale escaping his lungs. From the corner of his eye, James caught movement, a flutter of curtains in Ellen Harper's window next door. Her face appeared briefly, wide-eyed and pale, before vanishing behind the fabric. The neighborhood, so often a chorus of friendly chatter, had fallen eerily silent, as if holding its breath. The officer's presence was an anomaly, a rupture, in the fabric of their quiet lives, and James could feel the weight of unseen eyes beginning to gather. "You're on private property," he said, standing again, his voice steady now, cold with resolve. "Unless you've got a warrant or a damn good reason, you need to explain why you're harassing my dog." The tall officer's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as if James's defiance was a personal affront. "We got a call," he repeated, slower this time, each word deliberate. "A big dog, matching this one's description, chasing kids in yards around here. We saw him loose when we pulled up. He barked at us. That's enough to check it out." The shorter officer nodded faintly, but his gaze lingered on Drake, doubt creeping into his expression. The old dog hadn't barked, not really, just a weak, startled woof when the boots first crunched into the yard. Now he was silent, pressed against the fence, his body a trembling outline of fear. "Chasing kids?" James laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "He can't even chase a squirrel anymore. Look at his legs, look at his eyes. He's half-blind and stiff as a board. You're telling me this is your dangerous suspect?" He gestured at Drake, who let out another soft whine, his head dipping as if ashamed of the attention. The absurdity of it, the image of his gentle, graying companion as some menacing beast, would have been laughable if it weren't so infuriating. But the officers didn't budge, their authority a wall James couldn't break through with words alone. The tall officer stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the grass, swallowing Drake's small patch of sunlight. "We don't take chances with dog complaints," he said, voice flat. "If he's not a threat, we'll leave. But we need to confirm that. Step aside, sir, or this gets complicated." The threat was clearer now, a line drawn in the dirt, and James felt his hands clench into fists. Complicated. For who? For the old dog who'd spent his life giving nothing but loyalty and love? For the man who'd promised to protect him in return? Behind the fence, a muffled gasp broke the silence. Ellen Harper peering out again, her phone pressed to her ear. The neighborhood was waking up, the ripple of this intrusion spreading fast. James didn't know it yet, but in minutes, his quiet life would become a spectacle. a story whispered over fences and filmed on shaky screens. For now, though, it was just him and Drake against the looming uniforms, a standoff born of a mistake that threatened to unravel everything they held dear. The sun dipped lower, casting long, jagged shadows, and James planted his feet, ready to fight for the old soul trembling at his side. The golden light of the late spring afternoon began to fade, swallowed by the lengthening shadows that stretched across James Carter's backyard. Drake, the elderly Labrador Retriever mix, pressed himself tighter against the garden fence, his trembling body a stark silhouette against the weathered wood. His golden muzzle, flecked with grey, dipped low, and his soft whines punctuated the air, each one a quiet plea that clawed at the edges of the stillness. The two police officers stood firm, their dark uniforms cutting an imposing line against the softening sky. The tall one, with his hand still hovering near his utility belt, stared down at Drake as if the old dog might suddenly lunge, while the shorter officer shifted uneasily, his eyes flickering between his partner and the frail creature cowering before them. James was gone, only for a moment, he told himself, having stepped out for a quick errand to the corner store, expecting to return to Drake dozing peacefully in his sunny patch. He'd left the back gate unlatched, a habit born of trust in their quiet neighborhood, never imagining it would invite this. Now, without James there to shield him, Drake faced the officers alone, his world shrinking to the narrow space between the fence and the stranger's boots. The tall officer's voice boomed again, sharp and commanding. "Come here, dog, move it!" He clapped his hands, the sound cracking like a whip through the yard. Drake flinched, his legs buckling as he tried to shuffle backward, only to bump into the fence with a pitiful thud. His whine rose into a mournful howl, thin and shaky, the kind of sound that could break a heart if anyone was close enough to hear it. And someone was. Ellen Harper, James's next-door neighbor, had abandoned her curtains and now stood at her kitchen window, phone clutched in one hand, the other pressed against her mouth. Her graying hair framed a face etched with shock, her eyes wide as she watched the scene unfold. She'd known Drake since he was a floppy-eared pup tumbling through James's yard, and the sight of him, old, frail, and terrified, cornered by two uniformed men, was too much to bear. "Oh, that poor baby," she whispered, her voice trembling as she dialed Henry Brooks across the street. "Henry, get over here quick. Something's wrong at James's place. The police are after Drake." Henry, a wiry widower with a cane and a temper to match, didn't hesitate. He hobbled out his front door, the tap of his cane against the pavement echoing as he crossed the street. By the time he reached Ellen's fence line, he could see the officers through the slats, their raised voices carrying over the quiet hum of the neighborhood. "What in God's name are they doing to that dog?" he muttered, squinting at Drake's huddled form. The old Labrador's tail was tucked so tight it nearly vanished, his ears pinned back as the tall officer took another step closer, barking, "Stop moving or we'll make you stop." Henry's grip tightened on his cane, his knuckles whitening. "That's no threat, that's a scared old mutt. Have they lost their minds?" Word spread like wildfire through the suburban streets, a ripple of whispers and gasps igniting the once sleepy afternoon. Ellen's call to Henry sparked a chain reaction. Henry texted his grandson, who posted in the neighborhood's social media group, "Cops at Carter's place harassing Drake." "What's going on?" Within minutes, screens lit up with replies. "Drake, that sweet old dog by the fence, is this about barking? He barely makes a peep. Someone call James, he needs to know." The kids on their bikes slowed, clustering near the curb, their laughter replaced by wide-eyed stares. A young mother pushing a stroller paused, peering over her shoulder as the officers' voices grew louder, more insistent. Back in the yard, the tall officer crouched slightly, reaching for something on his belt. A leash, perhaps, or worse. "We're taking him in if he doesn't comply," he said, his tone flat as if Drake were a suspect resisting arrest. The shorter officer finally spoke up, his voice quieter, tinged with unease. "Sarge, he's old. Look at him. Maybe we should wait for the owner." But the tall one waved him off, his patience thinning. "We got a call about a dangerous dog. This is the address. He's loose," he barked. "He's coming with us." Drake's response was a shuddering whimper, his body sinking lower as if trying to melt into the grass. His cloudy eyes darted toward The house searching for James, but the back door remained shut, the porch empty. Ellen couldn't take it anymore. She flung open her kitchen door, stepping onto her porch with the phone still pressed to her ear. "You leave that dog alone," she shouted, her voice cracking with a mix of fear and fury. "He's not dangerous. He's James's baby. What's wrong with you?" The tall officer whipped his head around, startled by the interruption, his hand freezing mid-motion. "Ma'am, stay back. This is police business," he snapped, but Ellen didn't budge. Her hands shook, but her resolve held firm. "Police business? Scaring an old dog half to death? That's not right." Henry, now at the edge of James's property, banged his cane against the fence, adding his gravelly voice to the fray. "Drake's been here longer than half these houses. He's no menace. You're the ones causing trouble." The officers exchanged a glance, the shorter one's unease deepening, while the tall one's jaw tightened, his authority challenged by the growing chorus of defiance. From across the street, a few more neighbors emerged. Tom Ridley, a blunt-spoken mechanic, and a young couple with a toddler, all drawn by the commotion. Phones were out now, screens glowing as they recorded the scene, murmurs of disbelief rippling through the small crowd. "He's shaking like a leaf," Tom called out, his voice gruff. "You call that dangerous? Shame on you." The toddler pointed, tugging at his mother's sleeve. "Doggie's sad," he lisped, and the mother nodded, her expression darkening. "This isn't okay," she said, loud enough for the officers to hear. The air thickened with tension, the neighborhood's quiet unity fracturing into a raw, collective outrage. Drake, caught in the center, let out another howl, low and mournful, a sound that seemed to carry all the years of his gentle life, now reduced to this moment of terror. The tall officer straightened, his face hardening as the crowd grew bolder. "Everyone back off," he barked, his voice booming over the yard. "We're handling a reported threat. Interfere and you'll regret it." But the threat only fueled the neighbor's resolve. Ellen clutched her porch railing, tears pricking her eyes as she watched Drake's trembling worsen. Henry leaned heavily on his cane, muttering curses under his breath. The kids on their bikes whispered to each other, one of them, a girl with braids, slipping away to call her dad, a local firefighter who knew James well. Drake's world had shrunk to a haze of fear, boots too close, voices too loud, the fence his only frail shield. His breathing came in quick, shallow bursts. His body pressed so hard against the wood that slivers snagged his fur. He didn't understand why the strangers wouldn't leave, why the sun had abandoned him to this cold shadow. All he knew was that James wasn't there, and the absence ached worse than his stiff joints ever could. The officers loomed larger, their authority clashing with the neighborhood's swelling anger, and the yard, once a haven, became a battleground of misunderstanding. Somewhere, beyond the fence, a car engine rumbled closer, tires crunching gravel. James was almost home, oblivious to the chaos awaiting him. But for now, Drake faced the storm alone, his whimpers a fragile thread tying the neighborhood together. A thread that once pulled would unravel everything. The rumble of James Carter's old pickup truck cut through the thickening tension in his backyard, a low growl that seemed to echo Drake's fading whimpers. The sun had dipped below the rooftops now, painting the suburban neighborhood in hues of orange and gray, but the scene unfolding behind James's house was anything but serene. Drake, the elderly Labrador Retriever mix, cowered against the garden fence, his golden muzzle pressed into the grass, his trembling body a fragile outline against the splintered wood. The two police officers loomed over him, the tall one stern and unyielding, his hand still poised near his belt, and the shorter one visibly uneasy, his gaze flickering toward the growing crowd beyond the fence. The air crackled with voices, Ellen Harper's shouts, Henry Brooks's gruff protests, and the murmurs of neighbors clutching phones. But it all blurred into a distant hum as James pulled into his driveway, oblivious to the storm awaiting. "Him?" He stepped out of the truck, grocery bag in hand, the crinkle of plastic a mundane counterpoint to the chaos he was about to walk into. His boots hit the gravel with a familiar crunch, and he paused, squinting toward the backyard. The faint sound of Drake's whine, a sound he knew as well as his own heartbeat, pricked his ears, sending a jolt of unease through him. "Drake!" he called, his voice carrying a note of confusion as he rounded the house. The sight that greeted him stopped him cold, the grocery bag slipping from his grasp, apples rolling across the lawn like scattered marbles. Drake was pinned against the fence, his grey-flecked coat matted with dirt, his legs shaking so badly they barely held him up. The tall officer stood over him, one hand outstretched as if to grab him, while the shorter one hovered a step back, his face tight, with doubt. The old dog's eyes, cloudy, wide and desperate, locked onto James, and a low, broken howl escaped his throat, a sound so raw it sliced through the evening air. James's chest tightened, his breath catching as fury and fear collided within him. "What the hell is this?" he roared, his voice shattering the standoff like glass. The tall officer whirled around, his posture stiffening at the sight of James charging across the yard. "Sir, stay back," he barked, but James didn't slow, his boots pounding the grass, his eyes fixed on Drake. The shorter officer raised a hand, a half-hearted attempt to de-escalate, but it was too late. James was already there, dropping to his knees beside his dog, his hands trembling as he reached for him. "Drake, buddy, I'm here," he murmured, his voice cracking as he ran a hand along the dog's quivering flank. Drake pressed into him, muzzle nudging James's chest, his whimpers softening into shaky breaths. The warmth of his fur, the rapid thud of his heartbeat, it was all James could feel, all that mattered in that moment. "What are you doing to my dog?" James demanded, his head snapping up to glare at the officers. His face was flushed, his greying hair disheveled from the rush, but his eyes burned with a fierce, unyielding protectiveness. The tall officer straightened, his tone clipped and cold. "We received a report of a dangerous dog roaming yards in this area. This one was loose when we arrived, barking at us. We're assessing the situation." He gestured at Drake, who flinched at the movement, his ears flattening further. James's laugh was sharp, bitter, cutting through the absurdity like a blade. "Dangerous? He's 12 years old. He can't even climb the porch steps without help. You're scaring him to death over nothing." The shorter officer shifted, his voice quieter, almost apologetic. "Sir, we're just following protocol." The call said, but James cut him off, his anger boiling over. "Protocol? You call this protocol, cornering an old dog in his own yard? Look at him, he's terrified." He gestured wildly at Drake, whose trembling had eased slightly under James's touch, though his eyes still darted nervously toward the officers. The crowd beyond the fence grew louder, Ellen Harper's voice rising above the rest. "He's right, leave that poor dog alone." And James caught a glimpse of Henry Brooks banging his cane, Tom Ridley filming with his phone, a knot of neighbors swelling with every passing second. The tall officer's jaw tightened, his authority challenged, by the man kneeling protectively over his dog, and the chorus of outrage building around them. "Sir, step aside so we can handle this," he said, his hand inching toward his belt again. Whether for a leash or something worse, James couldn't tell, and the uncertainty fueled his rage. "Handle this?" he shot back, rising to his feet but keeping one hand on Drake's shoulder. "You're not touching him. This is my property, my dog, and you've got no right to barge in here and treat him like some criminal." Drake let out a soft whine, his head dipping as if ashamed of the chaos swirling around him, and James's heart twisted. He crouched again, stroking the dog's ears, whispering, "It's okay, buddy. I've got you." The old Labrador leaned into him, his breathing still quick but steadier now, as if James's presence was a lifeline pulling him back from the edge of panic. The sight of his companion, so gentle, so undeserving of this, only sharpened James's resolve. He stood again, planting himself between Drake and the officers, his voice low and steely. "You tell me right now why you're here, or you get the hell out of my yard." The tall officer's eyes narrowed, his patience fraying. "We got an anonymous tip. Large dog, aggressive behavior, this address. He was out here, no leash, no owner. That's enough for us to check." The shorter one nodded faintly, but his gaze lingered on Drake's shaky legs, doubt etching deeper lines into his face. "Aggressive," James repeated, his voice rising, with incredulity. "He barked because you scared him. He's half-blind, arthritic, he's not chasing anyone. You've got the wrong dog, and you're doubling down instead of admitting it." Ellen's voice cut through again, shrill with indignation. "He's telling the truth. Drake's the sweetest dog on this street. You're the ones acting aggressive. Henry chimed in, his cane thumping the ground. "Been here 10 years. Never seen that dog hurt a fly." The crowd murmured agreement, phones raised higher, capturing every word, every tremble of Drake's frail frame. The tall officer's posture stiffened, his authority slipping under the weight of so many witnesses, but he didn't back down. "We don't take chances with dog complaints," he said, his tone flat. "If he's not a threat, we'll leave. But we need to confirm that move, or we'll—" "Or you'll what?" James interrupted, his voice a growl now, his fists clenched at his sides. "You'll drag an old dog out of his own yard? Over some bad tip you didn't even bother to verify?" Drake whimpered again, pressing closer to James's legs, and the sound was a dagger to his soul. The shorter officer cleared his throat, stepping forward slightly. "Sarge, maybe we should call it in, check the details. He doesn't look—" But the tall one waved him off, his eyes locked on James, a silent challenge passing between them. The neighborhood held its breath, the tension coiling tighter with every second. James stood his ground, Drake trembling at his feet, the officers unyielding, and the crowd poised to erupt. The backyard, once a haven of peace, had become a battlefield, and James knew one thing for certain. He'd fight with everything he had to protect the old soul who'd given him 12 years of unwavering love. The air in James Carter's backyard hung heavy, thick with the scent of crushed grass and the faint tang of fear radiating from Drake. The elderly Labrador retriever mix trembled at James's feet, his golden muzzle pressed against his owner's leg, his grey-flecked coat quivering with each shallow breath. The sun had surrendered to dusk now, casting the scene in a dim greyish haze, but the tension burned brighter than any daylight. James stood tall, his broad frame a shield between Drake and the two police officers, his fists clenched so tight. His knuckles gleamed white. The tall officer glared back, his hand still poised near his belt, while the shorter one hovered uncertainly, caught between duty and doubt. Beyond the garden fence, the neighborhood's voices swelled, Ellen Harper's cries, Henry Brooks's gruff protests, and the murmurs of a growing crowd, fueling the storm brewing in James's chest. "You're not taking him," James said, his voice low and steady, a steel thread running through it. "This is my dog, my yard, and you've got no business here unless you can prove he's done something wrong." His eyes locked onto the tall officers, daring him to push further. Drake let out a soft whimper, his cloudy gaze flicking up to James, seeking the safety he'd always found in that familiar presence. The sound twisted James's heart, stoking the fire of his anger into something fiercer, a primal need to protect the one soul who'd never let him down. The tall officer's jaw tightened, his posture rigid as he took a step closer, boots sinking into the soft earth. "We don't need your permission, sir," he snapped, his tone dripping with authority. "We've got a report of a dangerous dog at this address, large, aggressive, roaming free. He fits the description, and he was loose when we got here. That's enough for us to act." He gestured sharply at Drake, who flinched, his ears flattening as he pressed harder against James's leg. The shorter officer shifted, his voice quieter, almost pleading. "Sarge, he's old. Maybe we should—" "Enough!" The tall one cut him off, his eyes never leaving James. "We're not here to debate. Step aside or we'll remove you both." His hand moved, an inch, maybe two, toward his belt, and James's stomach lurched. Was it a leash? A stun gun? The uncertainty was a cold blade against his spine, but he didn't budge. "Remove us," he shot back, his voice rising now, raw with disbelief. "You're threatening me over an old dog who can't even stand straight? Look at him! Look at him!" He gestured wildly at Drake, whose legs wobbled as he tried to shift. Closer, his body a trembling testament to his frailty. The old dog's tail was tucked tight, his ribs rising and falling in quick, anxious bursts, and his whine, soft, pitiful, pierced the air like a cry for mercy. James crouched beside him, one hand steadying Drake's shoulder, the other stroking his graying muzzle. "It's okay, buddy," he murmured, his voice softening despite the rage boiling inside. "Nobody's taking you from me." Drake leaned into the touch, his breathing easing slightly, but his eyes still darted toward the officers, wide with confusion and fear. The crowd beyond the fence erupted, their voices a chaotic chorus of Outrage. Ellen Harper leaned over her porch railing, her face flushed with tears and fury. "You're monsters," she shouted, her words trembling. "That's James's baby. He's never hurt a soul." Henry Brooks banged his cane against the fence, his gravelly voice cutting through. 12 years I've known that dog, gentle as a lamb. You're the ones out of line." Tom Ridley, phone raised, called out, "This is going viral. Harassing an old dog? You'll regret this." The kids on their bikes clustered closer, one whispering, "Why are they being mean to Drake?" as the young mother with the stroller shook her head, muttering, "This is wrong." The tall officer's face darkened, his authority fraying, under the weight of so many eyes. "Everyone back off," he bellowed, his voice booming over the yard. "This is a police matter. Interfere, and you're obstructing justice." But the threat only fanned the flames. Ellen clutched her phone, dialing frantically. Maybe James's number, maybe someone else to spread the word. Henry leaned harder on his cane, his glare fierce enough to bore holes through the officer's resolve. The shorter one cleared his throat, stepping forward. "Sarge, maybe we should call it in. Verify the tip. He doesn't look aggressive." "Look." At his posture, the tall officer shot him a withering glance. "We've got a job to do. He barked. He's loose. That's enough." He turned back to James, his tone hardening. "Last chance, sir. Move or we'll take him by force." He reached forward, hand outstretched toward Drake, and that was the breaking point. James surged to his feet, his body a wall of defiance, his voice a roar. "You touch him and you'll have to go through me first." Drake whimpered louder, scrambling to stay close, his claws scraping the dirt as he sought refuge behind James's legs. The shorter officer flinched, his hand hovering mid-air as if to intervene, but the tall one didn't hesitate. He grabbed for Drake's scruff, his fingers brushing the dog's fur, and James reacted on instinct. He shoved the officer's arm away, not hard enough to hurt, but enough to send a clear message. "Get your hands off him," he yelled, his voice cracking with emotion. Drake yelped, a sharp, panicked sound, and stumbled backward, his frail legs giving out as he collapsed against the fence. The wood groaned under his weight, and James dropped to his knees beside him, cradling the old dog's head. "Drake." I'm here," he whispered, his hands trembling as he felt the rapid thud of Drake's heart. The tall officer staggered back a step, his face twisting with anger. "That's assault," he barked, pointing at James. "You're under arrest." The shorter one grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Sarge, wait, he's just protecting his dog. Let's calm this down." But the damage was done. The crowd exploded, Ellen screaming, "Arrest him? For what?" Henry shouting, "You're the criminals here." Tom's phone captured it all, the lens steady as voices overlapped in a cacophony of disbelief. The kids gasped, the toddler wailed, and the young mother stepped forward, her voice firm. "Leave them alone. He's not the threat you are." James barely heard them, his world narrowing to Drake's trembling form. He pulled the old dog closer, shielding him with his body, his voice a broken murmur. "I've got you, buddy. They're not taking you." Drake's muzzle pressed into his chest, his whines fading into shaky breaths, and James felt tears prick his eyes, tears of rage, of helplessness, of love so deep it hurt. The tall officer loomed over them, his shadows swallowing the last of the light, but the shorter one stepped between them, his voice urgent. "Sarge, stop. This isn't right. He's no threat. We need to check the call." The tall officer hesitated, his hand still clenched, his pride warring with the mounting pressure. The neighborhood's fury pressed in, a tidal wave of support for James and Drake, and for the first time doubt flickered in his eyes. James didn't care. He held Drake tight, his resolve unbreakable, ready to fight as long as it took to keep his old friend safe. The yard, once a sanctuary, was now a crucible, and the clash had only just begun. The dusk had deepened over James Carter's backyard, the last streaks of orange bleeding into a bruised purple sky. Drake, the elderly Labrador Retriever mix, lay crumpled against the garden fence, his golden muzzle buried in James's chest, his trembling body a fragile anchor in the chaos. James knelt over him, arms wrapped protectively around the old dog, his breath hitching as he whispered, "You're safe, buddy. I've got you." The tall officer towered above them, his face a mask of fury, his hand clenched as if still itching to act, while the shorter one stood between them, his voice a strained plea. "Sarge, let's stop. This isn't right. But the air thrummed with more than their words. It vibrated with the neighborhood's roar, a swell of voices that refused to be silenced. Ellen Harper clung to her porch railing, tears streaming down her cheeks as she shouted, "You can't arrest him for loving his dog, leave them be." Her voice cracked, but it carried, piercing the tension like a beacon. Henry Brooks, leaning heavily on his cane, banged it against the fence with a ferocity that belied his age. "You call this justice?" he bellowed, his gravelly tone shaking with indignation. "Cornering an old mutt like he's some rabid beast, shame on you." Beyond the fence, the crowd had grown. Tom Ridley filming steadily, the young mother with her toddler now joined by others, their phones glowing like fireflies as they captured every moment. Kids on bikes whispered in hushed awe, their eyes wide, while a wiry teenager sprinted off shouting, "I'm getting my dad, he'll fix this." James barely registered the noise. His world narrowed to Drake's shaky breaths and the warmth of his fur against his hands. The old dog's whimpers had softened, but his body still quaked, his cloudy eyes darting toward the officers with a fear James couldn't erase. "Stay with me, Drake," he murmured, stroking the graying muzzle, feeling the rapid thud of a heart too old for this ordeal. The tall officer's threat, "You're under arrest," still echoed in his ears, a hollow menace that fueled his defiance. He tightened his grip, his voice rising, raw and unbroken. "You'll have to drag me off him first. He's not going anywhere with you." The shorter officer turned fully now, his hands raised toward his partner, desperation etching his face. "Sarge, listen, they're right. He's no threat. Look at him. He's scared, not aggressive. We need to call this in. Check the tip." The tall one's eyes flashed, his pride a brittle shield against the mounting pressure. "We don't back down because a crowd yells," he snapped. But his voice faltered, the certainty cracking as the neighborhood's fury pressed closer. Ellen stepped off her porch, her slippers slapping the grass as she marched to the fence line. "You're not taking Drake or James," she cried, her phone thrust forward like a weapon, recording now. "This is on you. Everyone's seeing. Hit." Tom Ridley's voice boomed over the chaos, his phone steady as he narrated. "Two cops harassing an old dog and his owner. Look at this. Share it, folks. Let the world know." The young mother joined in, her toddler clinging to her leg as she shouted, "He's harmless. You're the ones causing trouble." The kids cheered, a ragged chorus of, "Let Drake go," rippling through the dusk. Henry hobbled closer, his cane tapping a defiant rhythm, and growled, "I've got a lawyer friend. Keep this up, and you'll be sorry." The threat wasn't empty. Henry's son-in-law was a pit bull in court, and the tall officer's posture stiffened, his gaze flickering to the growing sea of faces. Drake shifted slightly, his head lifting to nudge James's chin, a faint wag of his tail signaling a flicker of trust amid the terror. James's throat tightened, tears burning his eyes as he pressed his forehead to Drake's. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We're getting through this." But the tall officer wasn't done. He stepped forward, again his shadow swallowing them, his tone cold. "You pushed me. That's assault. Move or I cuff you right here." The shorter one grabbed his arm, pulling back hard. "Sarge, no, stop. We're wrong here. Look at the dog. Look at the people." The crowd surged closer, some spilling onto James's lawn, their voices a tidal wave of outrage. "Back off. He's innocent. Leave them alone." A teenage boy, Henry's grandson, burst through, panting, his phone clutched tight. "Dad's on his way. He's calling the station. You're done." The tall officer's eyes darted, his resolve wavering as the reality sank in. He wasn't just facing James anymore. He was facing a neighborhood united, their anger a force he couldn't outmuscle. Ellen's voice rose again, trembling but fierce. "Drake's family. You don't get to hurt family." James looked up, his gaze locking with the tall officer's, a quiet fire burning beneath his tears. "You heard them," he said, his voice steady now, cutting through the din. "He's not just my dog. He's ours. You're not taking him. Tell me what this tip said or get out." Drake's breathing slowed, his body still pressed tight to James, and the old dog's trust fueled James's stand. The shorter officer nodded, his voice urgent. "Sarge, we need to verify it. Now, this isn't what we signed up for." The tall officer's hand dropped from his belt, his face a storm of frustration and doubt. He exhaled sharply, turning to his partner. "Fine. Call. Hit in." but he stays put until we confirm." He pointed at James, his tone grudging. "Don't move." James didn't flinch, his arm still around Drake, his defiance unshaken. "I wasn't planning to," he shot back, his voice a low growl. The shorter one pulled out his radio, stepping, a way to mutter into it, his words lost in the crowd's lingering shouts. Ellen sank to her knees at the fence, reaching through the slats to brush Drake's fur with trembling fingers. "Hang in there, sweet boy," she whispered, tears streaking her face. Henry stood beside her, his cane planted like a flag, his glare fixed on the officers. Tom lowered his phone briefly, nodding at James. "We've got your back, man. This is live. They can't ignore us now." The young mother scooped up her toddler, who pointed at Drake and lisped, "Doggy safe?" She hugged him tight, nodding. "He will be, honey. We'll make sure." The neighborhood pulsed with a raw collective heartbeat, their voices weaving a shield around James and Drake. Phones glowed, screens streaming the standoff to unseen eyes beyond the street, each frame a testament to an old dog's innocence and a community's refusal to let him fall. The tall officer paced, his authority unraveling with every crackle of the radio, while the shorter one waited, his expression a mix of relief and shame. Drake lifted his head slightly, his tail giving a faint thump against James's knee, a fragile sign of hope amid the storm. James held him closer, his voice a whisper only Drake could hear. "We're not alone, buddy. They're fighting for you, too." The old dog's eyes met his, cloudy but steady, and in that moment, the backyard, scarred by shouts and shadows, became something more. A battleground where love and loyalty stood tall, backed by a neighborhood that wouldn't let them break. The night had fully claimed James Carter's backyard, the bruised purple sky giving way to a star-pricked darkness that softened the edges of the chaos. Drake, the elderly Labrador retriever, Mix, rested in James's arms, his golden muzzle pressed against his owner's chest, his trembling finally easing into a weary stillness. The garden fence, scarred from Drake's frantic scrambles, stood as a silent witness to the ordeal, its weathered slats bathed in the faint glow of porch lights flickering on across the neighborhood. James knelt there, his breath steadying, his hands cradling Drake's graying fur, as if letting go might unravel the fragile calm they'd clawed back. The tall officer paced a few steps away, his authority dented but not broken, while the shorter one clutched his radio, its static crackle cutting through the hushed aftermath. The neighborhood's voices had quieted, but their presence lingered, a cowboyish wall of support encircling James and Drake. Ellen Harper knelt at the fence, her fingers still brushing Drake's fur through the slats, her tear-streaked face glowing with relief. Henry Brooks stood beside her, his cane planted firmly, his glare tracking the officers like a hawk. Tom Ridley lowered his phone, the live feed still humming, while the young mother rocked her toddler, whispering, "See, Doggy's okay now." The kids on their bikes hovered near the curb, their whispers blending with the rustle of leaves, and the teenager who'd run for help panted triumphantly, his dad, a burly firefighter, now striding up the lawn, fists clenched but held in check. The shorter officer turned from his radio, his voice tentative but clear. "Sarge, dispatch says the tip was vague. Large dog aggressive roaming yards. No specifics on breed or behavior. They're pulling the call log now, but—" He trailed off, glancing at Drake, whose cloudy eyes blinked sleepily up. At James. The tall officer stopped pacing, his jaw working as if chewing on the words he didn't want to swallow. "So what?" he snapped, his tone brittle. "He was loose, he barked. We acted on what we had." But the doubt in his eyes betrayed him, mirrored by the crowd's unwavering stares and the undeniable sight of Drake's frailty. James looked up, his voice hoarse but firm. "What you had was wrong. He's not roaming, he's in his yard, he's not aggressive, he's scared. You didn't check, you just charged in." He stroked Drake's ears, feeling the old dog's heartbeat slow beneath his touch, a lifeline, tethering him to this moment of hard-won peace. The shorter officer nodded faintly, stepping closer. "Sir, I'm sorry, it's looking like a mix-up. We'll need his papers, vaccinations license to clear this up. Can you get them?" His tone was softer now, a crack in the armor of protocol, and James met his gaze, seeing a flicker of genuine regret. "Yeah," James said, his voice steadying. But he stays with me. You're not handling him." He rose slowly, careful, not to jostle Drake, who shifted with a soft huff, his legs still shaky, but his trust unshaken. The tall officer bristled, his pride a raw nerve, but the shorter one raised a hand, silencing him. "That's fine, sir. We'll wait." He shot his partner a look, half plea, half warning, and the tall one exhaled sharply, stepping back with a grudging nod. "Get the papers," he muttered, his voice stiff. "But this isn't over until we confirm." James guided Drake toward the house, the old dog's paws dragging slightly, each step a quiet victory. The crowd parted, their murmurs softening into encouragement. "Good boy, Drake," Ellen whispered, wiping her eyes. Henry tapped his cane lightly, a rare smile tugging at his lips. "Tough old fella," he said, nodding at James. Tom called out, "We're still here, man, don't let 'em twist this." The firefighter, towering at the fence, folded his arms, his presence a silent promise of backup if the officers pushed again. James managed a small nod, his throat tight with gratitude, and led Drake through the back door, the familiar creak of the hinges a balm after the storm. Inside, the kitchen glowed with warm light, a stark contrast to the shadowed yard. James settled Drake onto his worn blanket by the stove, the old dog sinking down with a sigh, his tail giving a faint thump. "Rest easy, buddy," James murmured, kneeling to rub his ears, feeling the tension drain from them both. He rummaged through a drawer, pulling out a dusty folder, Drake's vet records, vaccination certificates, city license, all proof of a life lived gently, legally, loved. His hands shook as he clutched the papers, anger and relief warring within him, but he steadied himself for Drake's sake. "They're not taking you," he whispered, and Drake's eyes met his, cloudy but calm, a silent agreement. Back outside, James handed the folder to the shorter officer, his voice clipped. "Here, everything you need. He's vaccinated, chipped, registered, no threat to anyone." The officer scanned the pages, his brow furrowing as the truth solidified. Drake was no rogue beast, just an old dog caught in a cruel misunderstanding. He passed the folder to his partner, who flipped through it with a scowl, his silence heavy with reluctant concession. The shorter one cleared his throat, meeting James's gaze. "Everything checks out, sir. Looks like it was a mistake, the Tall officer's lips pursed, his pride swallowing the apology James deserved, but he stepped back, his voice flat. "We're sorry for the confusion. The report was off. We acted on it. Next time, keep him leashed, even in the yard." It was as close to contrition as he'd get, and James's eyes narrowed, his retort sharp. "Next time, check your facts before you scare an old dog half to death." Drake's soft huff from the doorway echoed his sentiment, a quiet rebuke. That needed no words. The officers turned, retreating across the lawn, their boots crunching gravel as they headed for their cruiser. The crowd watched, a hush falling over them, phones lowering as the tension bled away. Ellen clapped softly, a mocking edge to it that made the tall officer stiffen, but he said nothing, his partner urging him on. "Let's go, Sarge, they've got this." The cruiser's engine growled to life, headlights slicing through the dark as it pulled away, leaving the backyard bruised but unbroken. James dropped to one knee beside Drake, relief crashing over him like a wave. The old dog pressed his muzzle into James's hand, a shaky exhale signaling the end of his fear. "You're safe now," James whispered, his voice thick as he buried his face in Drake's fur. Ellen approached, her hand gentle on James's shoulder. "You both okay?" she asked, her eyes still wet. He nodded, forcing a small smile. "We're fine, thanks to you all." Henry grunted. "Damn right. They won't try that again, not with us watching." The neighbors lingered, their voices a soft murmur of support. "Good boy, Drake. He's a fighter. We've got you." A tapestry of care woven around them. The yard settled into an uneasy quiet, the night wrapping it in a tentative peace. James held Drake close, the weight of the ordeal sinking in, knowing this was only the end of the fight, not the story. But for now they'd won, and that was enough. The night had settled into a deep, velvet hush over James Carter's backyard, the stars above glinting faintly through a veil of thinning clouds. The garden fence stood silent, its weathered slats bearing the faint scars of Drake's desperate scrambles, splinters snagged in the wood, a testament to the chaos that had erupted only hours before. Inside the kitchen, Drake lay sprawled on his worn blanket by the stove, his golden muzzle resting on his paws, his grey-flecked coat rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. The elderly Labrador Retriever mix had finally drifted into a fitful sleep, his ears twitching at phantom sounds, a soft whine escaping now and then as if the echoes of raised voices still haunted his dreams. James sat at the table, a cold cup of coffee untouched before him, his hands clasped tight to still their trembling. The officers were gone, their cruiser's taillights long faded down the street, but the weight of their intrusion lingered like a bruise on James's soul. He replayed the scene in his mind, Drake's terrified whimpers, the tall officer's cold commands, the moment he'd shoved that hand away from his dog. His chest tightened at the memory, a mix of relief and rage churning within him. "You're okay now, buddy," he murmured, glancing at Drake, but the words felt hollow. The old dog's skittishness was new, his hesitation at the back door, his wary glance toward the yard where he'd once napped so carelessly. James rubbed his face, the lines around his eyes deepening with exhaustion and something heavier, a gnawing sense of injustice that refused to fade. The neighborhood hadn't let it fade either. Ellen Harper had lingered after the officers left, pressing a plate of cookies into James's hands with a tearful, "You call me if you need anything, here?" Henry Brooks had stayed by the fence, his cane tapping a restless rhythm as he muttered about overzealous fools in uniform. Tom Ridley's video had exploded online, the neighborhood's social media group buzzing with comments. "Disgraceful. Poor Drake didn't deserve that. Someone's got to answer for this." Each post a spark in a growing fire of outrage. James scrolled through the messages on his phone, his jaw tight, gratitude warring with dread. The support was a lifeline, but the attention felt like a spotlight on a wound still raw. He stood, crossing to the window, peering out at the darkened yard. The porch light cast a soft glow over the grass, illuminating the spot where Drake had cowered. James's stomach twisted. He'd built that fence himself, a boundary meant to keep his world safe, and yet it hadn't been enough. "Never thought I'd see the day," he muttered, his breath fogging the glass. Drake stirred at the sound, lifting his head with a faint wag of his tail, and James forced a smile. "Not your fault, old man. Never your fault." He sank beside the blanket, running a hand along Drake's flank, feeling the warmth of life beneath his fingers, a life he'd nearly lost to a stranger's mistake. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the kitchen, painting Drake's fur in golden streaks as he dozed fitfully by the window. James watched him, noting the way he flinched at the sound of a passing car, his ears pricking with a wariness that hadn't been there before. The ordeal had left its mark, not just on Drake, but on James too. He found himself glancing out, the window more often, his pulse quickening at the sight of any vehicle slowing near the house. "We're supposed to feel safe here," he said aloud, his voice rough with frustration. Drake's eyes met his, cloudy but steady, and James sighed, rubbing the dog's ears. "Guess we'll figure it out together, huh?" The neighborhood's reaction swelled by the hour. Ellen stopped by with a thermos of soup, her eyes red but her voice firm. "People are livid, James. They're talking about a meeting, pushing the police for answers." Henry hobbled over later, leaning on his cane as he recounted the online storm. "Tom's got 1,000 views already. Folks calling it animal. Cruelty. My son-in-law says we could file a complaint, make it official." James nodded, his mind churning. He'd always respected law enforcement. His brother had been a cop decades back. But this was different. Seeing Drake cornered, hearing that hollow threat of arrest, it rattled him to his core. Social media posts painted a vivid picture. Drake's the gentlest soul. How could they do this? Those officers need retraining. Who called it in? Someone's lying. James scrolled through again, his coffee growing cold, torn between appreciation and unease. The support was overwhelming, neighbors he barely knew offering kind words, kids leaving drawings of Drake on his porch, but it stirred a restless energy. What if the officers came back? What if the anonymous tipster struck again? He glanced at Drake, now pacing near the back door, his usual sunny spot abandoned. "You're not yourself, are you?" he murmured, crouching to coax the dog back to his blanket. Drake settled, but his eyes stayed fixed on the yard, a quiet anxiety James couldn't soothe. By midday, the story had spread beyond the street. A local news site picked up Tom's video, the headline stark: "Elderly dog harassed by police in quiet suburb." Comments flooded in. "Heartbreaking. Where's the accountability?" And James's phone buzzed with texts from friends he hadn't seen in years. "You okay? Saw Drake on the news. Unbelievable." He replied with terse thanks, his focus on Drake, who'd taken to whining at night, pacing restlessly near the door. James woke at 2 a.m. to find him there, his old friend staring into the dark as if waiting for shadows to return. "Nothing's out there, buddy," he whispered, pulling Drake close. But the lie stung. Something had been out there, something that shattered their peace. The thought gnawed at him. Should he file a complaint? He'd never been one to stir trouble, content with his quiet life. But seeing Drake flinch at every strange noise changed. That. Could those officers do this again to Drake, to someone else's pet? The idea of them misjudging another harmless soul, or worse, escalating beyond threats, kept him up, staring at the ceiling as Drake slept fitfully beside him. "You didn't deserve this," he said into the dark, his hand resting on Drake's side, feeling the steady rise and fall. "Nobody does." Ellen cornered him that afternoon, her voice urgent. "James, we're meeting tomorrow. Neighbors want action. You in?" He hesitated, glancing at Drake, who'd finally stretched out in a sunbeam, his skittishness easing for the first time since the ordeal. "Maybe," he said, his tone guarded. "I just want him to feel safe again." She nodded, understanding, flickering in her eyes. "We all do. That's why we're fighting." As she left, James sat beside Drake, the old dog's head resting on his knee, and felt a resolve harden within him. The backyard might never feel the same, but he'd be damned if he let this fade without answers, for Drake, for them all. Morning light filtered through the kitchen window of James Carter's home, casting a gentle glow over Drake as he lay on his blanket by the stove. The elderly Labrador Retriever mix stretched out, his golden muzzle resting on his paws, his grey-flecked coat catching the sun in soft patches. A week had passed since the police officers stormed the backyard, and though Drake's trembling had eased, a shadow of unease lingered in his cloudy eyes. He no longer napped by the garden fence, preferring the safety of the house, his steps, hesitant when James coaxed him outside. James watched him from the table, a half-eaten piece of toast forgotten beside his coffee, his mind churning with questions that refused to settle. Who had called the police? Why had they targeted Drake? The answers felt just out of reach, a puzzle piece missing from the fractured piece he was trying to rebuild. The neighborhood hadn't let it rest either. Ellen Harper had organized a meeting the previous night, a handful of residents crowding, her living room with coffee cups and righteous anger. Tom Ridley's video now had thousands of views, the online outrage spilling into real-world action, talk of petitions, calls to the precinct, even whispers of a protest. Henry Brooks had growled about digging up the truth, his son-in-law already drafting a formal complaint. James had gone, sitting quietly in the back, Drake's absence a heavy weight beside him. He'd nodded at their plans, but stayed silent, his thoughts on the old dog sleeping alone at home, waiting for him to return. "We'll figure out who did this," Ellen had promised, her eyes fierce, and James had managed a tight, "good," before slipping out into the night. Now, as the clock ticked toward noon, a soft knock jolted him from his reverie. He opened the front door to find a plain white envelope on the stoop, no stamp, no address, just his name scrawled in shaky handwriting. Drake lifted his head, sniffing the air with mild curiosity, as James tore it open, unfolding a single sheet of paper. The words hit him like a punch. "I'm sorry for what happened. I never meant for the police to hurt your dog. I was scared. A stray's been bothering my kids. It got out of hand. Please forgive me." No signature, no clue, just a confession that left James's heart pounding. He reread it, his fingers tightening on the page, anger and relief tangling within him. "A stray," he muttered, glancing at Drake, who tilted his head as if listening. Ellen arrived minutes later, her knock brisk and purposeful. "You okay?" she asked, stepping inside, her eyes narrowing at the envelope in his hand. "What's that?" James handed it to her, his voice rough. "Someone's sorry. Says they called about a stray, not Drake. Got the wrong dog, and it got out of hand." Ellen's face flushed as she scanned the note, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Coward didn't even sign it," she said, then softened, meeting his gaze. "But this means it wasn't spite, just fear and a hell of a mistake." James nodded, his jaw tight. "Doesn't fix what they did to him," he said, glancing at Drake, who'd settled back with a sigh. The neighborhood buzzed with speculation that afternoon. Helen shared the note with Henry and Tom, and by evening the social media group lit up again. A stray. That explains it. Who wrote this? We've seen a big dog lurking. Could be it. James stayed out of it, his focus on Drake, but the pieces began to fit. 2 blocks over, a wiry-haired woman named Clara Jones had posted weeks back about a mangy shepherd mix scavenging trash cans, startling her kids. Could be her, Henry mused over the fence, his cane tapping thoughtfully. New family skittish about dogs might have panicked. James frowned, the idea settling uneasily. Panic didn't excuse the fallout, but it shifted the blame from malice to misunderstanding. That night, a rustle beyond the fence caught James's attention. Drake's ears pricked, a low huff escaping as James peered into the dark. A lean, shadowy shape darted past, a dog, ragged and swift, vanishing behind a trash bin. "That's no Drake," James muttered, his pulse quickening. He grabbed his phone, texting Ellen. "Saw a stray. Big, fast, might be our culprit." Her reply was instant. "On it, we'll find it." The next morning, Henry rigged a motion camera near his alley, and by noon grainy footage showed a large, scruffy shepherd mix, Ranger, as Clara would later name him, prowling the shadows, his eyes glinting with hunger and wariness. James took Drake to the vet that day, needing reassurance after the week's strain. Dr. Patel ran her hands over Drake's joints, her voice calm. "He's stressed, but holding up. Tough old boy. Just keep him calm. Let him heal." James nodded, relief, loosening the knot in his chest, but his mind drifted to the stray. If Ranger was the real threat, how had the police landed on Drake? The note gnawed at him, its writer out there, anonymous, remorseful but silent. "Someone's got to own this," he told Ellen later, his voice firm. "Not just for me, for him." He patted Drake, who wagged his tail faintly, a flicker of his old self peeking through. Ellen rallied the neighbors, their mission shifting from outrage to investigation. "We've got a lead," she said, brandishing Clara's old post. "New family, 2 kids, moved in last month. Bet it's them." James hesitated, torn between confronting them and letting it lie, but Henry pushed. "If they're sorry, they'll talk. If not, we'll know." That evening, Tom spotted Ranger again, snapping a blurry photo, a lean, matted dog, far from Drake's gentle bulk. The group shared it online, a quiet call to action. "Seen this stray?" Might be why Drake got blamed. Responses flooded in. Sightings. Sympathy. A growing consensus that the truth was surfacing. James sat on his porch that night, Drake at his feet, the stray's shadow lingering in his mind. The note lay on the table, its words a bridge between anger and understanding. "They were scared," he said aloud, testing the idea. Drake huffed, his head resting on James's shoe, and James rubbed his ears, a resolve hardening. "Doesn't mean it's okay, but maybe we can fix this. Make sure it doesn't happen again." The neighborhood's hum surrounded them, Ellen's voice on the phone, Henry's cane tapping, the kids' bikes whirring past. A chorus of care that felt stronger now, tempered by purpose. A knock came late, tentative. James opened the door to find a typed letter. "I'm Clara, it was me. Can we talk?" And his breath caught. Drake stirred, sniffing the air, and James felt the weight of truth settle in his hands. The stray was real, the mistake was human, and the path forward was his to choose. He glanced at Drake, the old dog's eyes steady, and nodded to himself. "Okay, buddy," he whispered. "Let's hear her out." The morning sun spilled over James Carter's porch, warming the boards where Drake, his elderly Labrador Retriever mix, dozed beside him. The golden-muzzled dog stretched out, his grey-flecked coat catching the light, his tail giving a faint wag as James rubbed his ears. A typed letter from Clara. "I'm Clara. It was me. Can we talk?" Rested on the table, its confession igniting, a spark of purpose after days of unease. Drake's skittishness had eased, but the backyard still felt fragile, its peace marred by the memory of police boots. Today, James vowed, they'd reclaim it, starting with the stray that had set it all in motion. Ellen Harper arrived early, her knock brisk, her coffee thermos steaming. "Clara's coming," she said, settling beside him. "She's shaken, but ready to help. We're catching that stray, Ranger, right?" James nodded, his jaw tight. "For Drake," he said, patting the old dog, who huffed softly. The neighborhood had rallied since the truth surfaced. Henry Brooks's camera. Spotting the lean shepherd mix, Tom Ridley's online plea, "Help us find him," drawing sightings from blocks away. "He's the key," Ellen added. "Prove it was him, not Drake, and this mess clears up." James agreed, a quiet resolve hardening within him. Clara pulled up at noon, her silver sedan hesitant, her kids. Peering from the back, she stepped out, wiry and nervous, clutching a faded blanket. "This is his," she said, meeting James's gaze. "Ranger sleeps on it. I thought it'd help." Her voice trembled, guilt shadowing her eyes, and James softened. "Thanks," he said, gesturing at Drake. "He's why we're doing this." The old dog sniffed the air, tail wagging as Clara knelt. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. And Drake nosed her hand, a small forgiveness that eased her tears. Ellen took charge, rallying the crew. Henry set his camera near Clara's alley, while Tom and Mike, the firefighter, rigged a humane trap, chicken-baited, blanket-lined, behind her house. "He's skittish, not mean," Mike said, securing the crate. James watched from his porch, Drake at his side feeling the neighborhood's hum, kids on bikes scouting, the young mother posting updates, traps ready, a shared heartbeat driving them forward. "We're fixing this, buddy," he murmured, and Drake's ears pricked, a flicker of trust returning. Night fell, the group huddling near the trap, breath held as stars pierced the dark. James kept Drake inside, sparing him the tension, but watched Tom's live feed, heart pounding. At 11:30, Ranger crept in, ragged fur, wary eyes drawn by the scent. Clara whispered, "Come on," her kids watching from the window, and the stray stepped forward, the door snapping shut. Ellen clapped, Henry grinned, Tom cheered, caught him, and James exhaled, relief flooding through him as he joined them. Ranger panted in the crate, scared but safe, his lean frame a stark contrast to Drake's gentle bulk. Clara wiped her eyes. "That's him, not your dog." Mike nodded. "Lost, not dangerous." The next morning, a rescue traced Ranger to a family 2 towns over, his owner, Lisa, sobbing when they reunited her with him. "He bolted months ago," she said, hugging James. "Thank you." Clara smiled, her kids clapping, and James felt the knot in his chest loosen. A stray saved, a truth proven. Back home, the neighborhood buzzed. Drake's cleared. "Ranger's home." Tom's post sealing the win. Clara lingered, her voice soft. "I'll tell the police. Make it right." James nodded, patting Drake, who'd ventured into the yard again. "We'll make sure they hear." The old dog stretched. In the grass, tail wagging freely, and James knelt beside him, whispering, "You're safe now, buddy." The backyard glowed with dusk, a quiet triumph settling over them. Drake's peace restored, a community united, and a path forward carved from one old dog's heart. The late afternoon sun draped James Carter's backyard in a soft golden veil, its warmth coaxing Drake from the porch to the grass. The elderly Labrador Retriever mix stretched out, his golden muzzle soaking in the light, his grey-flecked coat shimmering faintly. 2 weeks after the police confrontation, Drake's skittishness had softened. His tail wagged more freely, his naps by the garden fence tentative but growing longer. James watched from the steps, a glass of water in hand, his chest lighter than it had been since that chaotic day. The capture of Ranger, the stray who'd sparked the ordeal, had lifted a burden, but the typed letter from Clara. "I'm Clara." It was me. "Can we talk?" Still weighed in his pocket, a bridge yet to be fully crossed. Clara arrived as the shadows lengthened, her silver sedan pulling up quietly. She stepped out, her hoodie traded for a simple blouse, her 2 kids trailing. With a shy wave, James rose, Drake's ears pricking as he shuffled forward, sniffing curiously. "James," Clara said, her voice steadier now, though her eyes flickered with remorse. "I thought they could meet Drake, if you're okay with it." He nodded, softening at the kids' hesitant smiles. "Sure, he's good with company." Drake wagged his tail, nosing toward them, and the girl with braids giggled, holding out a crumpled drawing, Drake in crayon, with "We're sorry" scrawled above. James took it, his throat tightening. "He likes it," he said gruffly, and Clara knelt beside Drake, her hand gentle on his fur. "I told the police," she said, meeting James's gaze. "Admitted it was me," explained Ranger, "the mix-up. They weren't thrilled, but they took it down. I'm so sorry, James, for all of it." He studied her, seeing a mother's fear, mirrored in his own protectiveness, and the last embers of his anger faded. "You were scared," he said, his voice low. "I get that. Just glad it's over. For him." Drake leaned into Clara's touch, a soft huff sealing the moment, and her kids sat beside him, their small hands stroking his coat. Ellen Harper's knock broke the quiet, her arrival brisk and purposeful. "Officer Miles is coming," she said, settling on the steps. "Wants to talk about that day." James's brow furrowed, but he nodded, patting Drake. "All right. Let's see what he's got." Miles pulled up shortly after, his uniform crisp, but his demeanor subdued, hands empty as he approached. "Mr. Carter," he began, crouching to meet Drake's gaze, "I owe you an apology, properly. I was there and I didn't stop it fast enough. I'm sorry for what we put you through." Drake sniffed his hand, tail wagging faintly, and James exhaled, the sincerity hitting home. "You tried," James said, his tone even. "Your partner didn't hear you, but it stuck with me." Drake shaking, cornered. "Can't happen again." Miles nodded, guilt etching his face. "It won't. I pushed the captain. New rules start soon. Training better. Checks on calls. Drake's why." James glanced at the old dog, then Clara, and felt a spark flare. "Good," he said. "I'll hold you to it." Ellen grinned, her voice sharp. "We all will. Meetings tomorrow with Hayes. Miles is on board." The officer straightened, resolute. "I'll be there. We're fixing this." The next evening, the community room hummed with neighbors. Ellen, Henry Brooks, Tom Ridley, Mike the firefighter, Clara beside her kids, who doodled quietly. Captain Hayes sat up front, her grey-streaked hair pulled tight, Miles at her side. James stood, Drake's leash in his pocket, his presence felt if not there, his voice rough but clear. "My dog's old, frail, loves this yard. 2 weeks back your officers nearly took him over a bad tip. He's still wary, won't sleep. Easy out there, that's not right." Ellen nodded fiercely. Henry tapped his cane and the room murmured support. Clara rose, her voice shaky but firm. "I made the call, thought Ranger was a threat. I was wrong and they didn't verify. It spiraled, hurt Drake. I'm sorry, but they need to do better." Hayes's face stayed stern, but she turned to Miles. "Your view?" He leaned forward. "We acted too fast. No proof, just a vague report. I saw Drake's fear, knew we'd messed up. We need training. Dog behavior, de-escalation, real checks. Starts next week." Hayes nodded, her tone clipped. "Agreed, new protocols, visuals or owner contact before action. Mandatory sessions, case closed." The room breathed relief, Ellen whispering, "We won," as Henry grunted, "Damn straight." Tom typed furiously, "Drake's justice." And Clara smiled at James, her kids clapping softly. Back home, James led Drake to the yard, the old dog settling in the grass, tail wagging freely. "They listened, buddy," he murmured, kneeling beside him. The fence a quiet sentinel once more. Miles dropped by later, a bone-shaped toy in hand. "For Drake," he said, and James took it, nodding. "It's a start." Clara lingered too, her kids leaving treats, their laughter a balm. "We're part of this now," she said, and James agreed. The rift healed. The backyard glowed with twilight, Drake basking in the calm, and James felt the shift. Not just peace, but purpose. The old dog's eyes met his, steady and bright, a bond forged through trial, now shining with triumph. "You're safe," James whispered, and Drake huffed, settling closer, their world whole again. Summer sun bathed James Carter's backyard in a golden embrace, the late afternoon light dancing across the grass where Drake sprawled, his golden muzzle tilted to the warmth. The elderly Labrador Retriever mix, grey-flecked and gentle, had reclaimed his spot by the garden fence, his tail wagging lazily as he dozed. 3 weeks after the police ordeal, the skittishness in his cloudy eyes had faded, replaced by a quiet trust that swelled James's heart. He sat on the porch steps, a cold lemonade in hand, watching his old friend bask in peace, a peace they'd fought for together. The fence bore a small plaque, Drake's Haven, nailed up by the neighborhood kids, a testament to their victory. The yard buzzed with life that day, a joyful gathering unfolding under the oak tree. Ellen Harper set out cookies, her laughter, mingling with the kids' squeals as they tossed a ball. Drake sniffed lazily. Henry Brooks leaned on his cane, gruffly recounting the day we stood up, while Tom Ridley and Mike the firefighter nodded, their pride palpable. Clara Jones sat nearby, her kids weaving daisy chains, their chatter a bright note in the air. James smiled, the scene a balm, Drake safe, the community whole, their bond forged in trial now shining in celebration. Lydia Grant, the local reporter, had sparked this moment. Her story, Drake's Courage Changes a Town, aired days ago, Tom's video paired with James's quiet words and Miles's reform pledge. "It's bigger than you think," she'd said, and now she arrived, camera in tow, her grin wide. "Ready?" she asked, and James nodded, lifting Drake gently as they stepped forward. The crowd hushed, phones raised in tribute. Lydia faced the lens, her voice warm. "From one dog's fear came a neighborhood's strength. Today we honor Drake and the change he brought." James spoke, his voice rough but sure, Drake's head resting in his palm. "He's been my rock for 12 years. When they came, for him you all fought back, saved him, saved us. Now he's why things are better." Drake wagged his tail, a soft huff escaping, and the crowd clapped. Ellen wiping tears, Henry nodding gruffly. Clara stood, her kids beside her. "I caused this. By mistake. But Drake taught me community. I'm grateful." Her voice trembled, and James squeezed her arm, a silent, "We're good." Miles stepped up, casual in jeans, his tone earnest. "I was wrong that day. Drake showed me. New rules start Monday. He's our lesson." Applause rose, and Lydia beamed. Drake's legacy. Compassion. Reform unity. She knelt, scratching his ears. "You're a star, old boy." The kids piled daisy chains on him, giggling as he tolerated it with a patient wag, and James's chest tightened with pride. As dusk fell, a bonfire crackled, stories flowing. Tom, replaying the video, Clara's kids petting Drake, Ellen's cookies vanishing. James sat with him, the old dog's head in his lap, whispering, "You did this, buddy." Ellen joined, her voice soft. "He's ours now." James nodded, tears brimming, always was. The precinct later hung a plaque for Drake, Compassion in Duty, and Clara's kids raised shelter funds with crayon cards, their small hands echoing his impact. The backyard glowed, a haven reborn, its quiet hum, kids' laughter, neighbors, voices, a song of love unbroken. "Good boy," he murmured, rubbing Drake's ears, feeling his steady breath. The old dog's eyes met his, bright with trust, and James smiled, the stars above a witness to a legacy that would endure. One gentle soul, one united heart.